Great.
From Louisville, Kentucky.
Okay.
I have lived here.
Okay.
No kidding. Oh, so you've been to church?
Hello, people on Zoom who are here at home, right? Okay, great. Well, we are wrapping up what has been a really cool month of touring this exhibit of We Don't Want. And so, as you know, through the weeks, we have looked at different aspects of the history of race and housing here in Metro Detroit. And hello, Linda, come on, great to see you. And today we really are wrapping up with an event that I think a lot of us, as I look at people that have the same color here I do, have actually lived through. Can I turn down the volume?
Yeah, just mute the computer.
And this is the Uprising, which at the time, when I was a kid, was called a riot, of a riotous section. Those people are rioting. And those people, we have learned through the decades that we are all one. And that we are here to grow above together, and we are here to understand one another. So I'm really thrilled to have Freda Sampson, whose dad is a pastor.
Was a pastor.
Was a pastor. Dad was her brother's a pastor.
Yes.
And so this is not her first time here, but we do welcome her. And she is going to speak with us on the 67 Uprising. And Des, of course, has been with us throughout the month. And we stretched out, we did the 31st.
Yes, we did.
Yep. And so if you haven't done this, I came in early last week for 2 hours and just read every one of these. And it really is informative. It messes with your preconceptions of the area. And I think that's what we're trying to do. Church is a place of transformation. Church is a place of growth. Church is a place of learning how to channel the love that's in our hearts. And so I'm really thrilled to have Freda here as our guest. Freda Sampson, born in Louisville, Kentucky, and looking forward to her presentation on the Uprising. And then, Des, you've got a camera. This is for the Zoom folk.
Yes.
Okay, good. So Zoom folk have a question. They can put it in the chat. You can see it, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So keep your questions. Freda's going to not have a long presentation, she told me, but she will be entertaining your questions as we move forward. Before we do that, the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Lord, this isn't just some academic talk. We ask you, Lord, for your spirit to use this transformation talk. Change the society starts with each one. And we ask you, the one who transforms, to work in our hearts, to do the work that we want. Bless Freda, and bless her with a superior recall of memory and the clear delivery we have to be able to learn, to grow, of your yourself. We pray. Thank you so much, Freda. Round of applause as we welcome our speaker.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It is fantastic to be here. I am going to, I didn't want to talk the last one because I wanted to be able to be heard pretty clearly, if that's okay. But I will keep my distance. How about that? It is really fantastic to be with you today. I know you all have been on quite a journey as Dad has ushered in some speakers, and of course, the immersion of this exhibit really puts in context in a very different way just what the experiences that we have felt, not only in metropolitan Detroit, but nationally, in terms of how life has been experienced by African American people of color in a significant way, largely because of policies that have been put in place, because of attitudes that have fostered and supported it, And because just of the division or the lack of connection with one another. So we're gonna get into that in a little moment, but I wanted to just bring note to this. You were listening to as you came in to Sweet Honey in the Rock. Woo! Okay, all right, you made me very excited.
I saw them once and it was life changing, so.
Aren't they fantastic? Is anyone else familiar with Sweet Honey in the Rock? Yeah. Okay, perfect, as I am not surprised by that. And so you know that they are indeed an a cappella group that really focuses on the African-American tradition of music. And what I love particularly about that, and the reason why I wanted to start kind of creating the environment by hearing a little bit of their music, is just the profound way that they're able to both ancestrally as well as in the contemporary lens, bring to light the narrative that exists within the African-American story. I think that it's really powerful and palpable. And so I wanted to kind of set the space in that way. But before I get started with everything else, let me just ask a real basic question. How was church today? How was service? Great. It was fantastic. If I did a quiz on inspiring. So if we did a quiz on what was spoken, you all could like give me a whole rundown. It's absolutely opened up. So, well, I'm glad that I am really glad that service was fantastic. As was indicated, I am a PK. I've been a PK all my life. I think that's the way it works. And as a PK or preacher's kid, I am deeply immersed in kind of the faith tradition. And if I'm going to be honest with you, my grandfather was a pastor. My brother is a pastor. It's literally the dominant career choice in my family. And so this has been my walk and my journey. It's always just such a blessing to be in a house. So first, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Des. Thank you for the privilege to be here and to be here. Without a shadow of doubt, for me, it is indeed my faith walk that has contextualized the work that I do. I learned from a very early age that it is both love and justice that makes a difference. It's not an either or, because we have to have both in order to really progress forward in our experiences collectively and create an environment where everybody feels as if they matter, they belong, they're valued, and they're able to live their best and full life. And so, you know, for that reason, I am just deeply appreciative of this experience. And I also want to say to this publicly, thank you for the invitation. I know you all have heard some fantastic speakers, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to circle back a little bit. Now, also, I'm only going to be up here for a few minutes. I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. The sun is shining outside, and I'm guessing, since it's been raining for the last 100 days, that we want to get out and experience a little bit of that sun, and I am super sensitive to that, so I will try not to prolong, but I do want to, before jumping into what it is I want to talk about, and I'm going to go beyond the 67 rebellion. I want to talk a little bit about something that we don't talk about very much as it pertains to this work, and I think that we have an opportunity, and I'm taking the privilege, and I hope it's okay, because I want to make some connections between what it is I'm going to talk about in 67. But I'm curious, and if you wouldn't indulge me, what is it about this exhibit that's had the most meaning for you? Has there been one narrative, or have there been multiple narratives in this exhibit that you've had a chance to hopefully experience over the last month? Has anything resonated with you?
Well, I grew up all my life in Detroit. I'm aware that this was going on around me. So in the last few years, I've come to realize what I had as a white middle class, lower middle class, whatever, was far different than what many people experience in Detroit. So it's been very informative and very moving.
Thank you. What's your name?
Janet?
Thank you, Janet. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Anyone had something revelatory that has come based upon their time? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I grew up in a family for a long time, Detroit area family. When I look at family pictures and how privileged, that some ways, so I feel and was problem. Really, it brings out my own culpability.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
What strikes me is how many, especially white people, don't know this. I talk to a lot of white people and not so much in this church, but people, you know, in general, and a lot of them don't know anything about this stuff. I grew up in Detroit, I had some kind of awareness, I guess. But even I learned things from exhibits, but there's a lot of lack of information. So, right. The whole history that I'm aware of.
Thank you. You know, what really resonates and is mirrored based upon what you shared this far is lack of awareness. And so when we think about just the fundamental, really the success of the intention of the system, it is to keep us apart, right? Some of the policies that have been constructed that have established it possible for us to live in different worlds for so long is in fact in its own way its own success, right? And yet to be able to be in an experience where we are able to make visible the invisible, it becomes a place of connection, right? It becomes an opportunity for relationships. This exhibit, and I don't know if Des shared with you the history of it since its time here. This exhibit, I'm very connected to personally. It was born in my office when we were creating an event with Wayne State Law School. We were doing a mock trial, and the mock trial was to put the Federal Housing Administration on task for the deeds that they had done to create this profound inequality for Black and brown people in this country. And so in the preparation and the research and development of that mock trial, we had embodied a ton of information, far too much to keep a secret. It was needed to share the information. So while the mock trial was only four hours and only reached 100 people, this exhibit has had an opportunity to reach hundreds of thousands of people. And so sometimes even when we're on a journey, we don't know where the journey is going to take us. But if we stay faithful and truthful in the process, the impact can be really powerful. So I am connected so much to this exhibit because it's part of the work that I've done. It's part of the work that I feel I get to continue to do, even though I'm not necessarily in its company or in its space too often. And so I know that you have heard from Peter Hammer, and Peter was able to, as Peter does, because he's brilliant, was able to show the racial segregation and unpack it through the mapping. Does that sound familiar to everybody? Okay, and really show how things have moved progressively because of white flight, because of segregation, and how it perpetrated the division. People make reference to the 67 rebellion as if that was the tipping point. The truth is the 67 rebellion was not the tipping point. White flight had begun in Detroit well before we got to the 67 rebellion. What made the 67 rebellion so convenient from a narrative perspective is that it gave rise and reason and cause for people to say, for white people to continue to move outside of the city. The 67 rebellion has been referred to as a few different ways. Referred to it as the riots, the uprising, as well as the rebellion. How did you hear it? In your understanding? How did you hear it, either growing up or it was recent? Yes.
Well, I'm of the age, I was a 21-year-old.
Well, I was 15 at the time, and I mean, it was so much on the news. My sister used to babysit and this little baby, she was twins. So she went on Monday, and it turns out that's where the woman worked. She had no idea. She went in her apartment, heads down to work, and finds out that, you can't go there. The roads are blocked. I assume just had a phone number. She had no clue this person. But my father-in-law was a Ferndale police officer at the time. So since they were 8 miles, they were calling his back up. He's very biased, was very biased. He wanted to stay home and protect his community. I go defend Detroit.
Yes.
Well, I probably should have spoken sometime before this was the first question that you asked, because my family been in Detroit since the 1800s. And as an African-American family growing up in Detroit in the 50s, it was a wonderful, fabulous, Black, middle-class family. And the reason as a family and environment, because Ford Motor Company in the 20s had offered $5 a day. And so people came from the South, and because they had wonderful benefits, Black folks could afford to pay for lawyers and doctors. And so it was an influx of African-American talent. So what I grew up in Detroit was a magnificent community. It was segregated, absolutely. In fact, when I went to Roosevelt Elementary School, Mitt Romney was there, and then they moved out. And that's when it began in the early 50s. I would always say, my parents would say 54, the brown people were of education when they tried to integrate schools. And the majority of white people said, no, we're not gonna do it. We're just not gonna do it. And so they started moving out. But my feelings about Detroit are so mixed because I was in college and home for the summer, the year of the '67 riots. But I had also experienced the horrible policing that had taken place. I even forget the name of the police, they call the Big Four or whatever.
Big Four.
The Big Four. They would stop and arrest you and take you in for whatever. I was riding in a car one night as a teenager with one of the first Black judges in Detroit, and they stopped us for being out after curfew on Jefferson Avenue. And instead of just letting us go after they discovered that Chucky was Charles Farmer's son, they took us down to 1300 Boat, put the girls up and put us in the room with prostitutes. And the boys, I mean, there's so many stories that come as a result of this, so I don't really even know where to start or stop. But to say that, and I have been remiss because this is the first time I've listened to all of your programs, but I haven't seen it. So this is the first time I'm actually seeing it. But I'm happy to be here and I appreciate the conversation. But there's always 2 or 3 sides to every story. And like I said, Detroit, I wouldn't trade this place for any place else growing up in the 50s and the 60s before the '67 uprising. It was a beautiful Black middle class world.
Thank you.
I know that throws a whole wrench into the whole story. in
No, as
some
a
way.
matter of fact, so thank you. And what I'm gonna do is completely throw out what it was I was gonna talk about. It's not the first time I've done that, let's just roll, okay? Because you bring up some very salient points. And when we think about Detroit, particularly as we look at how Detroit became such a robust African-American community, largely through the Great Migration that was really driven by Ford's $5 a day. I mean, it wasn't just Detroit, but it was a lot of these kind of middle spaces where it was parts of Ohio. I mean, there's all over the place where African-American people migrated to the north for opportunity. They migrated to the north for safety. They migrated to the north because they thought that it was going to be a better experience. And so to
Linda.
to Linda's point, at one time, this robust community, despite the profound segregation that really marginalized where Black people could live. When you think about Paradise Valley, you think about Black Bottom, particularly Sojourner Truth community. I mean, it's indicative of just what we're seeing in the exhibit, that there were particular communities that we were bound by. And that segregation was intentional and it was purposeful, and I apologize, let me do it right now. They get so talkative when I'm doing something. My apologies. But as brilliant as the experience that Linda was impacting was, it was also incredibly debilitating when families, 4, 5, and 6 families deep are living in one space because they don't have the ability to go beyond the margins that were depicted in the communities identified for African Americans. And so the opportunity for ownership, the opportunity to really live into that space that is part of that American dream, that American imagination was limited. It was limited. And even with that, as the expanse began to eventually occur, as white people began to move out and more neighborhoods began to open up. At one point, Detroit had the largest home ownership of African Americans in the country. I mean, that is amazing. And what it says certainly to me is the capacity and the ability to drive through, even when it has been otherwise constructed that we don't have access to it. Yes.
I was just gonna say, also to add to that, in the late 40s and 50s, the Detroit teachers credit union were one of the only places where you could get a mortgage to buy a house. And because Detroit had so many Black teachers, they got mortgages. And so when the housing opened up, they were able to purchase. There's complexity everywhere.
Everywhere, and same holds true with a lot of the churches. A lot of families got mortgages when it was finally available through the churches because access to traditional institutions like banks were not giving money to Black folk. So Greater Grace, I don't know if you're familiar with Greater Grace Church. Greater Grace really built a whole community of families that are still loyal to this day to that institution because, yes, ma'am, because of what they did for families. Yes, ma'am.
This is so surprising to me because I was born in 1947 on Hartford Street. But by the time I was ready to go through the 5th or 6th grade, Black people were starting to move to Northwest Detroit. And my parents moved to Linwood Street between right near 6 Mile. There were no Black folks on the other side of 6 Mile. Okay, and I'm going to Halliston.
Wow.
I don't realize any of this. And then when I went to high school, I went to Mumford High School. Mumford High School was 98% Jewish. But Black folks were, there was no limitations, there were no, I never felt any discrimination at all. So when I look at some of this, I wonder, was I the only one who grew up in Detroit, Michigan with no scars?
No. Well,
And some of my best friends were some of the Jewish kids.
we all have our stories and our experiences are ours and they're real and they're true, right? And so I appreciate what you're sharing. You talked about Harvard. I'm a member of Harvard Memorial Baptist Church now. My father was the pastor of Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, which was right down the street from Hartford on the Old West Side.
I was born across the street from Hartford Baptist Church.
Look at that connection. And I think part of this is, and really where I was going to go with what I was going to share out is really unpacking and telling the story, right? When all this is said and done and we look at the history and we understand the culpability of our federal government, we understand how the complicity of our businesses and really also mindset and how that was done not by happenstance. We didn't wake up one day and say, we don't want to live with each other. We woke up in a space driven and constructed by policies, by redlining, by blockbusting, that did not allow those connections to occur. And yes, the migration forth did begin to expand beyond the boundaries because of what we just talked about. But when we started talking about these different communities, that is going to be the reoccurring thing that as communities of color migrated out, it was because white communities migrated out further. So you got your central, your inner ring, your outer ring, and it just continues. And we see that today, right? We're still doing it. And so knowing the history, the value of you all being so intentional to take the time to learn this is so that not only is it a matter of reflection, but it's also a matter of projection. Because if we want something different with our tomorrows, that means we have to be aware of how we got to today and be intentional as to how we drive forward to make sure that we don't continue to do the things that we've done that have gotten us to here. You gonna say something?
I was just thinking, and I never, it's after I got this, my sister and I was out there on Telegraph on Long Lake or Square Lake, and her car broke down. And there's a business place right where God was, and we didn't have the cell phone at the time. So she says to me, run over to the bank, I think it's a bank, and see if they could let you in to use a phone to call for help. So I keep knocking on the door and he stood there watching me. And then I persist to knock on the door. So finally when he opened the door, I said, well, can I use your phone? My car broke down. He let me in to use the phone, and I did use the phone and got help. But when he let me out, he said to me, if I was a foreign, if I was a Black person, in other words, and from Detroit, was never gonna let me in. He heard how I was talking and he let me in. And I went back and I said, you know, I'm so surprised. He said he let me in because I didn't sound like an American Black. That's how I get to use the phone. And that's when I started really paying attention. That's what he told me.
Oh, I absolutely.
And I kept this story in me. And this is years ago, since before you could have a cell phone. Now everybody has a cell phone. And I still remember it. And then I went to work with a family and I tell my kids, well, you know, I'm sorry. I went to work with his family when I first came up here. And we were sitting on the table and the gentleman, the head of the house, he said, Gloria, come on and sit and eat with us. You know, the next thing she told me, we have people in the house working already, and he never called him to sit and eat with him. And that's when I don't understand. And I always say, well, maybe because of the migration, all the families live together close by because of what was going on in the South. So when they come north, maybe they didn't trust the white people, and it compound everything. So when I'm hearing these stories, it blows my mind, even though I had some experience.
Yeah.
You know, when I first came up with this, I gotta say this. When I first came here and I was at Kennedy Airport, I'm standing in the line to get on the plane. And this white gentleman, young guy, he just came and stood right in front of me. So I looked at him, I said, you know what? I was here before you. So you get in the back of the line. That's what I told him, not knowing this is what goes on. So when I came here, I was telling my sister, I said, you know, I was in the airport and this gentleman just came in front of me and I was here before him. And she said, you know, this is what goes on out here. You have to be careful. You know, and all these things happen.
Thank you. So here is, are you experiencing what is happening in this movement? Are you a member here?
Yes.
So the ability to be able to, with people we fellowship with every day, every week, to be able to dive deeper, to learn our stories, to learn our experiences, and to be able to see both the commonality and the differences and the unique challenges that people of color have experienced is not, the story is not going to be the same for everyone. We all have our own story, but there are some threads that really connect the stories together. You gonna say something like that?
Well, I was just thinking, in 1948, there were 12 Black hospitals in Detroit. Because Blacks could not go to the white hospitals. And so as of today, there are none. But that's the sadness of it all, that we've lost so much in the richness. But we also have to remember that Detroit was one of the last stops on the Underground Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a lot of Black people that came through that stopped here and stayed. They did not go across to Canada. So we still have a very rich tradition, and I keep repeating that because I was lucky enough to experience the richness of it all, even though I know it became less than rich at some point. So, I mean, these are things I'm throwing out only because I experienced them or I knew about them. But I didn't have any, except for Mumford, which we were both at, and I had wonderful friends there as well. I had no other white friends, none. It was an all Black world. So I have sought in my adult life to open that up, because that's what we have to do.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I was 18 in 1967. Those people think I'm 19, I realize I'm shocked. That's an internal joke. And there was no doubt in my mind that it was a riot. Having said that, I doubt if when I was 18, if I had ever met and talked to a Black person. There were no Blacks in Berkeley. There were no Blacks in my high school. There were no Blacks at my university, except maybe in my senior year, I senior member of the engineering department. I did one Black. So I was clueless. Arguably, I was clueless well into my adult life. And I suspect from an experiential point of view, I am still clueless because I didn't experience it. But this exhibit has been meaningful to me. Something that I think is on one of these posters is the Green Book, where Blacks traveling could find a safe place to stay, and have recreation. My family and I traveled throughout the country in the 50s and 60s, family vacations. We never looked at a book to figure out where we could stay, or where we could eat, or where we could be safe. It never occurred to us. I don't think it ever occurred to my parents. It certainly never occurred to me. And, you know, I've had a reasonably good life and I've been reasonably successful and I worked hard to do that. But I clearly had advantages and benefits from living in the environments that I did, going to the schools that I did. And I think I was oblivious to most, if not all of them. So I guess I continue to learn.
Well, isn't that the point? Yes, to continue to learn. So thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Piggyback off that, I went to college in Connecticut. It was a break. The way it is here. You talk about Massachusetts, talk about Vermont. You know, so many dorms, my roommate. You like to invite you home for Thanksgiving. You know what you eat. And you know, I laughed when I said, "Oh, we eat watermelon and fried chicken and all that stuff." And I could see he was visibly hurt by it. And then, you know, I thought, eat whatever you eat, you know. And then going back to the riots, I didn't grow up here. But from what I understand, a lot of people from veterans came back from Vietnam. You know, they were getting like sort of like unemployment. It was very hot. They was tired of getting pushed around by the police. You know, the big four, I heard a story that they would police would sit on park benches to bait you to rob them. Then you'd be jumped on, killed, locked up. And then when they hit that house, that's when it all broke loose. And I went to school with a young man who, his cousin, he saw him get shot in the back by the National Guard. And, you know, he was very young at that age, so your cousin running 8 or 9 years old, he was shot by the police to the martial law. You know what I mean? It's crazy. And I grew up, and a lot of people, because of the color or the pigmentation of their skin, I don't want to say they intentionally passed themselves, but people of other ethnic backgrounds looked at that person and assumed they were white, or at least white enough to fit in. Because I know people that went to either Mulford, the surrounding schools, and the Jewish people threw rocks at them sometimes when they were coming home from school. They had to run home. There's stories even about Southfield. People were told not to move to Southfield because Southfield was going to become the next Detroit. So, anyway, I got a head full of stuff.
And you hit on a few hundred subjects, so I'm willing to stay for the rest of the week. I'm just gonna check to see, because you brought up so many different elements of this experience, right? And it's no way we're gonna be able to captivate all of them within our brief time. But I do think that one of the most important things that I hope you take away from this is the curiosity, is the wanting to know more, wanting to learn more, and delve more deeply into the stories and talking to each other so that we can hear not only those stories from an external experience, but for our congregation, for your members, the relationship with people that you currently have, to be able to really listen and learn from each other. We all have a story. And one of the things that I was really going to focus on today was to make visible the invisible. And the invisibility is around understanding the stories, that yes, we have to understand it from a systemic perspective. Systemically, this country was constructed in a way that created the vision that we are still experiencing. We're experiencing it in some ways as real as we were in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. So we have to know what those systemic issues are so that we can butt up against them, so that we can interrupt them. But in order for us to be able to deal with it also emotionally, we have to connect to the stories. We have to understand that these aren't numbers and these aren't figures that are away from us. These are human beings that walk amongst us, right? That have a deep and rich story to share. And really being able to unpack that story, to listen to that story, to learn that story, really helps us all be more aware of what we can do both individually and collectively. And I see, as I was walking up today and I saw the kind of the cemetery, I was immediately moved. And so thank you for that, because that was powerful. And when I saw it, I said, I'm in a safe space. And so for me, every time I go out, I am measuring the safety of the space I'm in because of the intersectionality of my race and my gender. That's real for me every day. I wake up every day remembering I'm a Black woman. I go out the door every day thinking about how I'm navigating the world around me as an African American woman.
You know, I never experienced, I don't experience that. I love my church family. When we all for the COVID, I miss them. I mean, I really miss them. My daughter says, Mom, why don't you come down and stay with us? I said, I'm not ready for that. I miss my church family. You know, these are my family. And I never felt out of place.
And amen.
Amen to
Which is a
that.
host.
Because what I'm hearing, it's where I came from, both Black and white went to church together. We had confirmation classes together. So when I came and I still, I couldn't, you know, I couldn't fathom it until now, especially with this exhibit. The one that really struck me that I was really upset about is about the dentist. Yeah.
Yeah.
That
I
really
went
hurt.
inside, I was with-
I was really upset about it.
Yes, ma'am.
There's a book called The Arc of Justice that tells the story of the Ossian Sweet, am I saying that right?
Yep.
Sweet case. And it's very informative and moving. I highly recommend it for anybody that wants to do a deep dive into that.
The author's name is Kevin Boyle. And you are absolutely right. It's an amazing book. And you know, listen, we have access to the internet, which is also gives us, all we have to do is begin to Google and research and do some things. I always say, read as many books as you can, but also get in a video or article or whatever else to connect it. The story around the Green Book, when I grew up, that experience was my experience. My father and as a family, we traveled only once in my entire life on vacation because of the trauma that was associated with not being able to stop for gas, not being able to go to a restaurant to use the facilities or to order a hamburger, having to be concerned about being in certain places after dark because of sundown times. And so when the reference of the Green Book came to pass, we would think that would not be an issue anymore. Well, while we don't have a Green Book formally to my knowledge, people still are very thoughtful. Black people, African-American people are still very thoughtful in how we travel because of a safety factor in 2021, right? And so what we see on these panels does not mean we've gotten past all of this. Quite the contrary. It has found a way, because that is, let me just be frank, what racism does really, really well is it reconstructs itself. It reformats itself to the present day. What was slavery became the Black Code, Jim Crow, became segregation, became different types of institutions so that we can still have to be separated. And so it shapes shit. So just keeping that in mind, that while we might want to look at these panels and say, wow, that was a time back then. In so many ways, that is a time right now. We just experienced the difference between, for me, riot, rebellion, and uprising, is that the moment that people have experienced a tipping point because of oppression, it's different. It's different. There was not a desire to just wake up and tear down our own communities. But when you are driven because of systemic racism, because of militarism, because of housing segregation, because of unemployment, not for a day or a week or a month or a year or a decade, but really for generations, that tipping point is why I call it a rebellion. I'm pushing back. I'm pushing back. Enough is enough. I am done. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things I've never understood, and maybe with your research you can help me understand this, is during the rebellion, the riot, the things that were burned were Black communities. They were Black successful communities that I understood, like down Livernois, 12th Street. I used to walk 12th Street as a student at the hospital. What benefit, why in protest or an uprising burn down those things that were successful for the Black community?
That is a great question. That's a great question. Right. And thank you for asking that. I can speak to it from a couple of perspectives. One is access. I'm angry right now. I'm here. Two, not all the businesses that were in those communities were Black owned. And to be able to distinguish the Black owned from those that were not, when you are in a space of anger, right, was not something that person or those people may have been thinking about in that way. Now, there were some Black owned businesses that had the capacity to put, I believe they put an excellent, was it an
An X, and then you would even see Soja put on it to identify
to identify.
Soja.
I didn't hear that.
Soja, like soldier
I don't know.
In the end, that didn't
or
mean
soul
anything.
brother. Yeah.
It didn't mean anything.
So
Because the National Guard actually threw firebombs into several stores that were on 12. And this is verified.
And we've seen that go forward in our present day with the Black Lives Matter movement that really transpired at the George Floyd's death, and the Black Lives Matter movement was already in play, without a doubt, as is indicated by your gravesite. But what the reporting was over and over again is that it was not always Black people that was doing that, right? But there were provocateurs that were coming into these environments and igniting activity so that fundamentally it would be reflected and blamed on those that were there, right? So it's same thing. It's not, and I'm not, listen, that's not a pass, because what I'm saying is that there were also a lot of Black folk, a whole lot of Black folk that did that. And is that the best way to manage things? I don't think so. But when we have a tipping point, because we all in our humanity have capacity for a tipping point. And we have seen tipping points from different political perspectives occur even this year. And so it is a matter with what it is that, what do we do with that? And how do we learn from that? But in terms of why there, it was access. If I can't leave my own community without being policed, let me try to come to your community. I won't even get to the edge of it. Let alone to get to the edge of it with the intent to burn over that. Right. I am so way past my time. I mean, like really way past my time. And you know, I never started my PowerPoint. But it is all good. The essence of what it was that I was going to share with you was really around storytelling. And I was going to ask you, when you look at this with this banner, and as it's talking about the 67 rebellion, and just as you leave, if you would, just look at the women that are in that large image and begin to imagine their story. And that's what I wanted to say, that with all this that's said and done, I wanted to talk about the invisibility of Black women in the larger experience of our history, of our American history is being narrated. That is a very patriarchal system and is reinforced as such. And so we don't hear about our stories. We don't hear about our power and our presence throughout history. And I wanted to take some time for us to really look at it through that lens. So I invite you to do that at your leisure. Please continue to delve into this, learn more, listen to each other, share with each other, and let's grow collectively in our understanding and our awareness and in our activism with each other. So with that, I am going to stop. Thank you. For those who are online, thank you for staying with us. And if you have questions, if you have more questions, I will be here for a few minutes, but I appreciate the work that you all are doing, and I applaud the effort, and I hope that you continue to dive deep. And I have a funny feeling that this young man here has a lot to say, but he's but maybe you all will get to hear, because something tells me you got some wisdom that you're just holding on to, right? Am I right? Yeah. So with that, I will stop and just say thank you for Yes.
Do you have any recommended reading? Because I forget who here's, I don't know, but I mean, this is the stories that this tells are absent from the history class that we get. And I was born in 1984, so I only heard stories, right? And the stories that I heard were scary, right? Because that was what my mom's family experienced, right? And it's not the full story, but to like, I guess, how do we educate? What do we do? Like, what can we do to bring this narrative to the forefront? I think that to perpetuate the scariness of what happened isn't helping anybody, and it's not bringing us together, and it's driving us further apart, because there are, obviously, like you said, 3 or 4 different sides to every story. So what can we do? What can we read? What actions can we take?
Yeah, fantastic question. And there is a great deal of literature. I invite you to read Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. An amazing book. To your point, The Art of Justice is also very good. How to Be an Anti-Racist, Igor Extended.
About the Dawn of Detroit.
Who is that?
A Chronicle of Slavery and Freedom in the City of the Straits by Taya Miles. She was a African-American professor at University of Michigan. That's written. In fact, you could look it up as a nice New York Times article if you just Google that, because she talks about how all the streets of Detroit were named after slaveholders, many of them. Woodward and all of the,
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful book.
What was the name of the book?
It's The Dawn of Detroit by Taya, T-I-Y-A Miles. Let's see, there's the Dawn of Detroit. Chronicle of Bondage and Freedom in the City of the Straits.
And Cass was by Isabel
Wilkerson. Yes. And I'm pulling up my Audible playlist real quick because I had 1,000 books on my shelf and none of them are here with me. But also while I'm doing that, I Googled. I do think there's something to be said by using whatever your search engine is and just investigating more deeply. Detroit Public Television has a wealth of documentaries to review that I think are very insightful and very helpful. And I would be happy, I actually had a list and I didn't bring it. So I'm remiss, I had about a 4-page list of resources. And I'm like, well, we don't have time to get to that. So I
Could you email that or?
Yeah, if you send
email
it to me.
Can give it to Father.
Yep.
So we can distribute it, please.
Absolutely.
I also, and I'm speaking, I may be digging a hole here, but just yesterday, my other daughter brought me over a book
that she recommended I read, that she picked up at a local bookstore. I have no idea of the validity of this book, but it's a memoir by a African-American woman on her mother's life running numbers in Detroit. But it also, she said, gives a great deal of depth about the housing restrictions, what life was like for a Black family in, would be the 50s and 60s. So I'm looking forward to reading it, and right now I can't think of the title, but I don't know if you're aware of it. It's Fanny, I think Fanny.
I don't know that I'm aware of it. Does that sound familiar to you, Des?
No.
I'm trying to think of the title of it, but it was a true story.
I've got the book at home.
Yeah.
I'll let people.
Why
I know
don't they teach
Daryl
this
will.
stuff in the public school?
Oh, we need 6 to 10 more minutes. I mean, that's absolutely fair question. And that is, and because we are operating in the racist system, let me just start on, right? And so there are so many stories that are not moved into the narrative of the American story. It's been, the filtering has been deliberate and it's present. It's not like we just don't hear about this. There is real-time shifting occurring around what can be in school books moving forward. Conversations happening today in these spaces will determine what our children get to know, how that information has been revised, revisionist history, right? So that, for example, slavery is now being trying to reframe and reformat to kind of voluntary service. Slavery, right? And so it is that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Rosa Parks are literally the only Black people that have ever done it. And they've done fantastic. Listen, they're all my heroes. But there's so much that we don't know, and there is real intention. That is this whole conversation around critical race theory. That's what's turning people on their heads, right? And so that's why we have to do our own work. And what we have known is historically in communities, it's important for us to tell our own stories. We see it activated in the Jewish community. We tell our own stories, but we got to be able to tell our own history in absence of an institution doing it until we can change the culture of that institution. That's where our personal responsibility comes into play.
Now in a way, I understand why they riot. When I say riot, the Black people, why they get so angry and break stuff up, because they have all this stuff inside and they want it out. And it seemed like it's a restriction. So when they get mad, they just do whatever they want to do. I might some of the things I disapprove of, but it's a lot of history that's keeping them upset.
And that's part of the vision that we hear. When we don't know the stories, when we don't know the truth, and we automatically ignite our bias and make assumptions that these folks are behaving this way because they're bad. I mean, that's what happens when we fill in the blanks because we don't know the story, because we don't know the experiences, because we don't know the truth about how, no matter how hard, I was just reading something, as a matter of fact, just this morning, no matter how hard an African-American family might aspire for wealth, because of the system, it will take generations for a Black family today to have the wealth of the average Black family, assuming time stood still for the White family and it progressed forward for the Black family. It would still take generations. So the degree of inequality, because of systems like the Federal Housing Administration, who made it fundamentally impossible for Black and brown people to have the wealth accumulation occur, because the value of the properties that they lived in was devalued automatically because of their existence, not because of what they did, not because of what they believed, where they went to church, how they fed their kids, if they washed their dog. It was simply because they were Black. And the moment that they moved outside or tried to move outside the community, before we tried to move outside our community, if we tried, as you know, as in the Austin Sweet School, the pushback was because if you come here, your blackness is going to reduce the value of my home, and I can't have that.
The book that you're referring to is The World According to Fannie Davis.
Yes.
Yeah. But I would also recommend everybody read W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folks.
Absolutely.
Because his original premise is the problem of the 20th century, which is now the 21st century, is the color line. And that's where we find ourselves.
That's where I would start. The Soul of Black Folk.
W.E.B. Du Bois.
That is a important book. And then as you evolve forward, White Fragility of Robin DiAngelo. Yes, ma'am.
Are these? Thank you. Displays in a book?
Nope.
Well, because I'm thinking about, you know how they have, you can go to Barnes and Noble or someplace in there, those sepia toned books on the history of Detroit or the history of anything, any place. It seems like this should be in one.
So you gotta charge this. Now you can do it now.
So we are actually in the process of turning this into a virtual display so that folks can access it. A lot of this history in that, you know, like, as you can see just through the conversation, that the stories and the information come from so much resources and stuff like that. We've actually been very intentional about not putting this into a published piece, and that because the information, the imagery, and that there's a different feel when you can actually be in a space to see this and experience it than if you're just reading about it. And it also creates the opportunity when it is in a space and that to create conversation and to create the opportunity to build community in a space, and that like what we're doing now and that. And so we've actually been intentional about not putting it into a book, and that because it can be easy for folks to take off with it and
I can
sit
see
on a
that
shelf.
because, like the Mona Lisa, right? There's
Mhm.
nothing like seeing the Mona Lisa, although
Yep.
people wouldn't know about the Mona Lisa and want to go see it if we didn't see the books. So it's just a different opinion, but I think it would also reach people that may not
Yep.
be coming to something on
Yep.
a Sunday. And I find it very informative, very fascinating, and if there were books, I would, you know,
Yep.
fill my Christmas list.
Yep.
For the people with it.
Yeah, so we are gonna make it virtual, so that way it is accessible for some folks, and that, because we've actually had this exhibit even in national conferences and that, you know, and so, you know, because really what we see here and that it's a set of patterns, and that like one of the big things about being like looking at systems and institutions is recognizing the patterns. And that like this exhibit's not only traveled the state, but when you start looking at like the United States as a collective, you'll find these patterns, you'll find these stories in other communities, in other areas, that they'll have different names, they have different faces, but it's still a pattern in that. And so like this exhibit then becomes a case study of Metro Detroit and that. And so that's why one of the reasons why we're looking at making it virtual, and that because we have garnered interest from a few groups that nationally, and it's not exactly easy to ship this. And that, so we do want to make it accessible, but the virtual piece, that because of that experiential piece, is why we're looking at doing a virtual exhibit, and that so we can try and make it as immersive as closely possible as if you were seeing it in person.
Well, it's a wonderful exhibit and you can change your mind and put it in the
Certainly.
And Des hasn't mentioned it, but this is only a small portion of the exhibit. I mean, the exhibit is, there are many, many other aspects to and components of this exhibit, which really can create some more dynamic experience. And so maybe if you all have a chance to bring it back at a later time, you can bring in some of those other elements.
Yeah, it's missing a couple pieces, as well as our 20-foot timeline.
Now, is this housed somewhere or is this a travel exhibit?
It's traveling.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Has the Historical Society of Michigan been aware of it?
Yeah, we've actually been on their boards. I'm trying to think what it is. And that, like, Freda was actually on it, you know, like for when they host their annual conferences for the Southeast Michigan and that. And so we've worked with them and partnered with them throughout the years. We've also had it over with the Detroit Historical Museum. It's been there. It's gotten around but it's still a really well kept secret and that. So, you know, like if you know of places or and that you think would be interested in it and can host it, like, you know, invite them. And then I'll make sure that you guys have my contact information, or you can reach out to Father Chris and that, because he's got my contact info. And that, so we can definitely make it accessible.
Yeah, and Des, I don't know if you've shared, it's been seen by over half a million people.
Yeah.
And so, and that's because, and I applaud a lot of, when I transitioned from Mission Roundtable, my baby, I handed it to Des for her care. And she has done a phenomenal job in making sure that people continue to experience. And one of the things that I so appreciate about the vision and the work that is done around this exhibit is that the most important thing is the learning. And so it's not designed for just corporations, right? You don't have to necessarily have this huge price tag to be able to have access to this, because it really is, in terms of the work that she's doing and Roundtable is doing, it really is building those conversations, networking communities, and really finding those cohesive spaces where we can actively progress against, move forward against kind of the divisive policies and structural racism that has really deconstructed our abilities to live with each other, right? And so it is a tool and an important tool in the work that they are doing. I just wanted to share, I was trying to get to this number thing in terms of value. When you think about the Federal Housing Administration, Richard Rothstein says enormous difference in wealth is absolutely attributable to federal housing policies implemented in the 20th century. By the way, when you think of how that looks, in 2016, white families had an average net worth of $171,000 in 2016, 10 times that of the average Black family with a net worth of $17,000 from $150. In the same vein, for those who live in the top 10% of income, the number gets even bigger. You know, in that top 10%, we imagine how people attain and aspire through business, through education, home ownership, all of those elements that really allow you to continue to build your net worth. White families' net worth household income was $1,789,300. The same apples to apples for Black people. The overall median net worth was $343,160. What can you do with the difference? How can you educate your children differently? How can you travel differently? How can you build businesses differently? How do you expand your network to be even more differently when you're starting out with more? That is a direct line item to the Federal Housing Administration and devaluing the properties of Black and brown people. So, as you know, in this country, most of us gather our wealth through our home ownership. That's our biggest asset. So when our biggest asset is automatically devalued because of the color of your skin. You know, I love the neighborhoods in Detroit. They're rich and they're beautiful. And I live in a neighborhood in Detroit that is historically African American. But my house, my 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom, brick colonial is probably worth significantly less. No, not probably. I know for a fact it's worth significantly less because I'm still housed in the city of Detroit. If I picked it up and moved it to the edge of Grosse Pointe or Farmington Hills or some of these other beautiful areas, I would be then more able and more apt to build my own network. So just that.
And it's probably better built.
It's very well built. It's
Some
very, very
of
well
these
built.
places out here.
So I will absolutely get a list, which will encompass websites, it will encompass books, it will encompass articles for your reading and viewing. And I'm also going to include this article here in that list, because that will provide a lot of information statistically from the data perspective on how these variations are impacting. So, once again.
Thank you.
It's been fantastic.